ただいまより第6回人間文化研究機構日本研究国際賞授賞式を開会いたします。はじめに主催者を代表いたしまして、人間文化研究機構機構長木部暢子よりご挨拶申し上げます。
それでは式辞を申し述べます。本日第6回目の人間文化研究機構日本研究国際賞を授賞式を挙行する運びとなりました。これは当機構といたしまして喜びに絶えないことでございます。この度コロンビア大学歴史学教授ジョージ・サムソン教授職のキャロル・グラック先生を第6回目の受賞者に決定いたしました。先生の長年の研究活動と日本研究振興へのご功績に対し心から敬意を表しますとともにお祝いを申し上げます。グラック先生、おめでとうございます。この日本研究国際賞は一般財団法人クラレ財団のご協力のもと、日本研究の国際的発展と日本文化の理解を深め広めることを目的として2019年1月に設立されました。この賞は海外を拠点として日本研究に、日本に関する言語、文学、歴史、民族、フォークロア、エスノロジー、環境などの人間文化研究において学術上特に優れた成果を上げ、日本研究の国際的発展に大きな貢献をされた研究者を受賞の対象としております。過去5回の受賞者の方々は、日本文学研究、日本近現代史、日本仏教研究、民族フォークロアおよびエスノロジー研究、それから言語研究の第一人者であり、現在も第一線でご活躍されていらっしゃいます。この度受賞されたグラック先生は、日本近代史の研究者として、米国を拠点に国際的に活躍され、グローバルな視点から最新の歴史研究をはじめ、文化研究、社会分析の理論を駆使した多岐にわたる研究成果を上げておられます。また、世界各地において、日本近代史に関する会議を主催されるなど、歴史研究を軸として日本研究を世界に広げ、さらにその水準を高めることに貢献されてきました。加えて、革新的な教育プログラムを指導し、大学院生を含めた次世代を担う若手研究者の育成に尽力されるとともに、新聞やメディアを通じてアカデミアの地を社会に還元されていらっしゃいます。受賞者の選考にあたりましては、機構内外の有識者12名で構成する選考委員会を設置し、厳正な審査選考の結果、グラック先生を受賞者とすることを決定いたしました。審査に当たってくださいました選考委員会外部委員の皆様には厚く御礼申し上げます。さて、人間文化研究機構は2004年に 大学共同利用機関法人として設置され、20年が経ちました。これからも自然と人間との調和や平和の創出といった21世紀のさまざまな課題に立ち向かい、真に豊かな人間生活の実現に向けた新たな総合研究を国内外の研究者や大学等研究機関と連携して推進し、発信してまいる所存でございます。引き続き当機構の活動にご理解ご協力を賜りますようお願い申し上げます。最後になりましたが、受賞されたキャロル・グラック先生を長きにわたり近くで支えてこられたご家族の方々に心よりお祝いを申し上げるとともに、先生のますますのご研究の発展とご健康を記念し、式辞とさせていただきます。令和7年3月19日、人間文化研究機構長、木部暢子。おめでとうございます。
続きまして、第6回日本研究国際賞の選考の経緯につきましてご報告申し上げます。日本研究国際賞は、さまざまな研究分野を専門とする委員を中心に構成される選考委員会において、受賞者の選考が行われております。本日の授賞式には、選考委員の中から、国家主管学習院大学名誉教授、佐野みどり様、青山大学名誉教授、近藤康弘様、株式会社クラレ常務執行役員、藤波悟様にご出席いただいております。それでは選考委員会委員長を務められました佐野様より、選考の経緯につきましてご報告いただきます。佐野様、よろしくお願いいたします。
ただいまご紹介に預かりました佐野みどりでございます。それでは今回の第6回日本研究国際賞の選考の経過と、それから選考理由について簡単にお話しさせていただきます。ご報告いたします。まず書記官より推薦いただきました候補者を最終2名に絞りまして、それぞれの方への国内外のレビュアーを委員会の内部で検討し、決めました。でその後レビューが届きました後に、いただきましたレビュー、それから書記官から提出されている選考資料、あるいはご著書ご論考などを各選考委員が検討し、そして第2回の選考委員会を開催いたしております。でその次、選考委員会において、やはり歴史研究を軸とした日本研究を世界に広めるとともに、その水準の向上に大変大きな貢献を果たされました誠に際立った日本近現代史の研究者であられるキャロル・グラック教授を受賞者に選ぶ、全員一致で選ぶに至りました。先ほど機構長よりすでにご丁寧な説明、グラック先生のご業績の説明もありましたので、少し重複することになりますが、簡単に選考理由を説明させていただきます。1985年にプリンストン大学出版局より刊行されましたグラック教授の「Japan's Modern Myths」Ideology in the Late Meiji Period は、英語圏におけるオリエンタリズムの下での日本像を脱却して、近代国民国家としての日本の展開を膨大な資料を用いて描き出したもので、それまでの特殊な国日本という歴史像や日本観を大きく転換させるものであり、 ジョン・キング・フェアバンク賞を受賞されています。また、日本及び海外の学者による革新的な機構をまとめ、日本の20世紀史に関する国境を越えた新たな対話を生み出した賞は、The Japan Hirohito。これは1992年ノートン社の刊行です。や、Words in Motion Towards a Global Lexicon。これ2009年にデューク大学の出版会から出ております。で、グラック教授の果たされた役割は、教授の異文化間対話への深い関心と知的な幅広さ、そして司会における指導力をよく示すものでありますし、また教授が日本とアメリカとの共同研究に熱意を持たれ、色川大吉氏や安丸義雄氏など日本の歴史学者を招聘されるのみならず、彼らの首長の英語訳にも取り組まれたことも注目すべきことであると考えました。このようなグラック教授の日本研究における影響力は学会内部にとどまらず、パブリックヒストリーの分野においても多くの業績を残されておりますし、先生が組織された公開講座やシンポジウム、また日本やアメリカなどの主要な報道機関におけるメディア討論など、歴史論争に関する専門知識を国際的な読者と共有すべく多大な貢献を果たされております。グラック先生はその長く卓越したキャリアを通じて、日本研究と歴史学の分野における革新者であると同時に指導者でもあり、また後進の研究者の指導育成にも注力し、世界の日本研究会での指導的役割を果たす多くの若手研究者をも支援されています。また、ジャパンフォーラムやジャパニーズ・スタディーズ、ソーシャル・サイエンス・ジャパン・ジャーナル、メモリー・マインド・アンド・メディアなど、数多くの学術誌の編集員も務められてこられ、日本研究の普及に多大な貢献を果たされています。以上、選考委員会は、日本、米国、その他の国々との間に知的な架け橋を築かれ、何世代にもわたる新進の日本研究者に限りないインスピレーションを与えてくださったキャロル・グラック教授を第6回受賞者として選んだことを、ここに大きなる喜びとともに報告いたします。以上でございます。
佐野様、ありがとうございました。続きまして、日本研究国際賞の授与を行います。キャロル・グラック様、どうぞ中央へお進みください。
人間文化研究機構日本研究国際賞キャロル・グラック殿、あなたはグローバルな視点から日本近現代史、国際関係史および歴史学と記憶について研究をされ、日本研究の国際的発展に大きな功績を残されました。そしてその研究は最新の歴史研究をはじめ、文化研究、社会分析、さらに他の諸科学の理論を駆使し検証する学際的なものとなっています。また、日本と米国との共同研究や大学を拠点とした学際的な教育プログラムなどを通じ、次代の育成にも注力し、世界の日本研究の主導的な役割を担う研究者を数多く輩出するとともに、アカデミアと社会との知的な架け橋としての役割も担ってこられました。よって、ここに第6回人間文化研究機構日本研究国際賞を受賞し、その功績をたたえます。 令和7年3月19日、大学共同利用機関法人人間文化研究機構長、木部暢子、おめでとうございます。
おめでとうございます。続きまして、記念品としてメダルの贈呈を行います。ありがとうございました。グラック様、木部機構長、どうぞお席にお戻りください。続きまして、賞金の贈呈を行います。株式会社クラレ常務執行役員、藤波悟様より贈呈いたします。グラック様、再度中央へお進みください。それでは藤波様、よろしくお願いいたします。ありがとうございました。ここで藤波様よりお祝いのお言葉をいただきます。グラック様はお席にお戻りください。
クラレの藤波でございます。本書を助成しておりますクラレ財団を代表して一言ご挨拶を申し上げます。グラック先生、この度は本当におめでとうございます。クラレ財団は、化学メーカー、ケミカルの化学ですね、であるクラレが母体となって設立された一般の財団法人でございます。でクラレはケミストリー、つまり自然科学ですねをベースとしてテクノロジーを施行するというタイプの会社でございまして、で一見このような人文科学に関する表彰をですね講演するというのはちょっと直結しないと思われるかも分かりません。けれども私どもとしてはテクノロジーというのはあくまでも人間の生活、人間の暮らし、あるいは社会というものをより良いものにしていくために使われるべきものというふうに考えておりまして、そういった意味で、人間社会あるいは文化といったものを極めていこうとする人文科学の分野にですね私どもも強い関心と深い洞察を持つべきであるというふうな考えからこの賞を講演させていただいております。で今ほどご紹介がありましたとおりグラック先生のご業績、大変歴史学の分野で世界的に影響の高い業績を立派な業績を上げておられます。で特に先生の著作の中にですね歴史で考える Thinking with History という著作がございます。まさしく歴史を学ぶということは歴史を通じて今を考えるあるいは未来を考えるということが先生の視点の真髄ではないかというふうに考えております。私ども企業人としましてもビジネスが今世界中に広がっておりましてクラレグループの従業員ももうほぼ半分が海外の社員という形になっています。そういった中でそういったいろんなバックグラウンドを持つメンバーとコミュニケーションを取るときにやはりそれぞれが持つ歴史あるいはその背景にある文化ですとかものの見方考え方といったものを踏まえながら一つの目標に向かっていくということがこれからの未来を作っていく礎になるのではないかというふうに考えております。そういった意味でグラック先生の業績非常に示唆に富むもので私ども大変学ばせていただいております。グラック先生には今後もですね今のご研究をより深めていただきますとともに後に続く後進の方々の育成にもご活躍いただきますようにお祈り申し上げて私からのご挨拶といたします。先生どうもおめでとうございます。
藤波様ありがとうございました。 お席にお戻りください。続きまして、ご来賓の方よりご祝辞を賜りたいと存じます。まず、文部科学省研究振興局長、塩見瑞恵様よりご祝辞を賜ります。それでは塩見様、よろしくお願いいたします。
ご紹介をいただきました文部科学省研究振興局の塩見でございます。第6回日本研究国際賞授賞式の開催、誠におめでとうございます。はじめに、ただいま受賞の栄に訳されましたキャロル・グラック教授に対しまして、心から敬意と祝意を表します。誠におめでとうございます。また、本賞の選考委員会および人間文化研究機構の関係の皆様、本賞の趣旨に賛同し、多大なご支援をいただいている一般財団法人クラレ財団の皆様に対しまして、深く感謝を申し上げます。先ほどご紹介がありましたとおり、グラック教授は、日本近現代史の傑出した研究者として、国際的に活躍されており、世界各国の大学において、客員研究員を務められ、後進の研究者の育成や、国際的な日本研究のネットワーク構築にも貢献いただいております。さらにさまざまなアウトリーチ活動を通じて、学会内にとどまらない影響力を発揮されていらっしゃると承知しています。こうしたご業績は、世界における日本研究の発展に大きく貢献するものであり、グラック教授のこれまでのご功績に対し、改めて深く敬意を表します。本賞を主催する人間文化研究機構は、人間文化研究に関する唯一の大学共同利用機関法人として、人間文化に関する総合的で多様な研究を展開し、学術文化の進展に寄与することを目的に、我が国の人文学の研究の発展を牽引されています。本賞を一つの契機として、世界における日本への理解がさらに深まるとともに、日本研究における新たな展開や価値の創造につながる成果が創出されることを期待しております。文部科学省といたしましても、デジタルヒューマニティーズをはじめとする人間文化研究機構の活動への支援等を通じまして、人文学諸分野のさらなる発展に向けた取り組みを推進してまいりたいと考えております。結びに、グラック教授とこれまでグラック教授を支えてこられましたご家族の皆様のご健康を祈念いたしますとともに、今後のさらなるご活躍および国内外における日本研究のますますの発展を祈念いたしまして、お祝いの言葉といたします。本日は誠におめでとうございます。
塩見様、ありがとうございました。続きまして、日本女子大学名誉教授、成田隆一様よりご祝辞を賜ります。それでは成田様、よろしくお願いいたします。
ご紹介いただきました成田隆一です。祝辞を申し上げたいと思います。グラックさん、この度は栄誉ある賞をお受けになり、誠におめでとうございます。30年を超えて40年に及ぼうという年月をグラックさんと共にしてきました身としては、一人としては大変嬉しいことと存じます。今40年ということを、それを及ぶということを申し上げましたけれども、これには実は諸説ありまして、というのは、グラックさんの記憶と私の記憶にずれがあるのですけれども、最初の記憶は、でも最初にグラックさんとお会いしたのは、1989年夏、アメリカの西海岸サンディエゴで開かれたその大きな会議の場であったということは確実であるというふうに思います。この会議は、これは後に戦後史の中の日本という形で、日本でも2冊の本として翻訳をされるという、そうしたその、プロジェクトでありましたけれども、そのプロジェクトの会合に、私はその当時勤めておりました東京外国語大学のその、メンバーの一人として参加をいたしました。 で私は実はそれまでに先ほどご案内もありましたけれども、おぼつかない英語力でグラックさんの主張であるところの近代日本の神話群ジャパンズ・モダン・ミスズという書物をそれを読んでおり、そしてそのグラックさんが提供される近代日本史像に驚嘆をしておりました。グラックさんにお話をするときには大体いつも3つの点がありますという形でお話をするので、今日も3つの点でそのグラックさんの近代日本の神話群についてそのお話をさせていただきますと、一つは歴史学の本であるのに文化人類学等々のその方法議論をそれを取り入れて、そして日本研究をするためのその方法を丹念に議論しているということがあります。これ1番。で2番目は、そうしてそこから紡ぎ出される近代日本像というのは単線ではなくってその、分厚い記述というものがその本の中で出されている膨大な資料というものもその方法のその検討と重ねてそこで展開されているということになります。これが2つ。で3つ目は、そうしてその結果単数ではなくて複数のその近代日本の神話というものが提供されているというところに衝撃を受けていました。でそのためにグラックさんとサンディエゴでお会いできるということを大変楽しみにしてまいりました。大変幸いなことに、この時の東京外国大学のそのアメリカに向かったメンバーの団長山内康さん、ちなみに副団長は伊予谷俊夫さんであって、でそしてそれに私が加わるという実は3人のメンバーだったんですけれども、その3人のメンバーがグラックさんと初対面であったにもかかわらずすっかり意気投合いたしまして、でそして、89年その夏にその足でグラックさんのニューヨークのお宅に伺うというそういう幸運に恵まれました。またそこでその後毎年チームを組んでグラックさんを中心とするアメリカの近代日本研究日本研究の人々と交流をしようというそういう取り決めがなされて、でそしてその後実際に、私も含めてそのメンバーは毎年のようにアメリカ東海岸に伺うということになりました。その日本研究者とのプロジェクトというのが、開始されるようになりました。山内グラックプロジェクトですけれども、その他にグラックさんが組織をしてくださって、アメリカの東海岸コーネル大学ですとかハーバード大学ですとか、あるいはプリンストン大学ですとかいうそういうような方たちもその常連で参加をしてくださるというそうしたプロジェクトが始まりました。1989年にその話が具体化して、そして1990年翌年からそのプロジェクトは開始したんですけれども、このプロジェクトというのはその後コロナ禍でアメリカに行くのが難しくなる2020年まで30年間続く。毎年アメリカに30年そのプロジェクトを組んでグラックさんたちとそれから交流をするということをそれが続きました。大概は秋に訪米をいたしましたけれども、グラックさんからは、外語プロジェクトっていうその母体になったその呼び方でもされましたけれども、定期的にアメリカに渡るので渡り鳥という名前もいただいて、その渡り鳥プロジェクトが本当に長く続いた。これは何にも代え難いことだったというふうに思っています。アメリカの日本研究と日本研究との接点というのがそこで出来上がって広がっていったということになります。もちろんグラックさんたちも日本に複数回やってくるというそういうようなこともあり、非常に緊密な国際共同研究と いうものが開始されたというふうに思っています。今でこそ国際共同研究というのは、これは日常のことになっていますけれども、その頃はまだまだその始まりであったというふうに自負していますが、ここでも3点にわたって整理をしてみますと、1つ目は1989年ちょうど冷戦体制が崩壊するその直前に出会ったということで、そのことはこれはつまりそれまでの冷戦体制の下での、つまり日本の戦後というそういう下での人文知、人文学の知というものを、それを批判的に再検討しようというプロジェクトにおのずからなりました。アメリカの方たちは、グラックさんを中心にアメリカの方たちは地域研究というもののありようというものが大きな問題意識としてあり、日本から渡っていくメンバーとしては戦後歴史学というのが、あるいは戦後思想というのが一体どういうものであったのかということの検討ということが共通の問題、共通の話題となるような、そうしたプロジェクトになりました。これは一つ目で、2つ目はそうしたプロジェクトというものはさらにですね、アメリカの東海岸だけではなくって、もちろんアメリカの中部西部の西海岸の方たちをも巻き込みながら、さらにドイツ、フランス、オーストラリア、中国、あるいは韓国というところの研究者の参加を得て、歴史研究にとどまらず文学、あるいは社会学、さらに社会思想というところまで議論を及ぼす壮大なプロジェクトということになりました。でそうした成果の一つが、グラックさんが歴史家の広田正樹さんと共に監修をされた3冊本のシリーズ、歴史の語り方というものになって、一つの具体的な形を生み出しました。またこのプロジェクトの中から総力戦体制論というものも、これも出来上がって問題提起をして、そして日本の側から世界に向けて発信をするという、そういうこともそれも行っていきました。でこうしてこの1990年代から2000年代にかけて、近代日本の歴史像というものを、それを軸に方法的にも叙述的にも、あるいは認識論としても大きく展開、ターンですね、展開していったという、そういうことが、これがグラックさんとの間で可能であった、出来上がっていったというふうに思う次第であります。でその一つの流れとして、その一つの結晶というものが、日本の場合においては歴史教育において見られる歴史総合という、ちょうど2022年から高等学校で実際に始まりました新学習指導要領に基づく新しい科目、今までの世界史、日本史というそういう区分ではなくて、歴史総合として展開をしていくという、その歴史総合というのは、こうした大きな一つのプロジェクトの流れの中にあるというふうに私は思っています。でそのことをグラックさんにお伝えしましたところ、グラックさんはすぐにですね、歴史総合の教科書をそれを読んで、そして雑誌の思想に歴史総合が持っている、日本の文脈にとどまらず、世界の文脈の中におけるその意味というものを、それを文章を寄せてくださいました。そのタイトル、ごめんなさい、海外からのその歴史総合に対する一番早いと言っても良い、そうしたその言及であったのですけれども、批評であったのですけれども、そのタイトルは万歳2章っていうんです。つまりよくやったけれどもまだ万歳3章には届かないねという、そういう意味を込めたグラックさんの批評であったということです。 グラックさんはこうして内在的な批評をしてくださるとともに、その理解をしてくださるとともに、同時にやっぱり厳しい批判、知ったというものも、それも必ずその中には込められているということになります。グラックさんのこうした内在的に理解するとともに厳しい批判というのを忘れないという、そういうこの、リーダーシップを取るということによって30年以上の共同研究というものが可能になり、近代日本の歴史像というものがこれが大きく変わるということになり、さらにはそれが歴史教育を通じて次世代にまで影響を及ぼすことができるということを改めて思う次第です。グラックさんのような歴史家というのは日本では非常に稀有な存在であるというふうに思います。歴史認識をもとに過去を語り、現在に発言をし、そしてその先を見通していくという、そういう歴史家です。アカデミズムの中で発言をするとともに、現在の社会情勢や世界情勢にも言及する一方、日本研究というのを足場にして広く世界に目を配り、各国の日本研究者のみならず地域のそれぞれの地域の歴史研究者とともに議論をしていくという、そういう姿勢を保たれています。狭い意味での、古い意味での歴史家をはみ出す歴史家であって、深い思索と広い視野による対話の姿勢というものを、それをずっと保ち続けられていらっしゃる。でそのことは先ほども紹介されましたけれども、グラックさんの歴史で考えるという、そうしたタイトルに凝縮されているというふうに思います。グラックさんと知り合うことができ、そして共に共同研究ができたことは誠に幸運なことでした。この幸運というのは、私一人にとどまらず、日本研究全体、いやいや学知そのものにとって大きな幸運であっただろうというふうに思います。今日の受賞はそのことを、その審査に当たられた先生方はじめとして、皆がその思いを同じくしたためであろうというふうに思います。グラックさん、今日はどうもおめでとうございました。
成田様、ありがとうございました。これをもちまして、日本研究国際賞授賞式を終了いたします。引き続き、日本研究国際賞の受賞を記念いたしまして、キャロル・グラック様より、ウォーメモリー80 years on と題しましてご講演いただきます。はじめにご講演いただきますキャロル・グラック様のご略歴などをご紹介させていただきます。グラック様はコロンビア大学にて学位を取得され、1974年よりコロンビア大学東洋学部日本史講師に着任されました。その後、1975年、コロンビア大学歴史学助教授、1977年、コロンビア大学東アジア学科長、1986年、コロンビア大学歴史学教授などを歴任され、現在はコロンビア大学歴史学部ジョージ・サンソム教授職としてご活躍されております。また、ベネツィア大学客員教授、ハーバード大学客員教授、パリ社会科学高等研究院客員教授、東北大学統合日本学センター特任教授、東京大学法学部客員研究員、東京外国語大学客員教授なども歴任されております。主な著書といたしましては、1985年の Japan's Modern Myths, Ideology in the Late Meiji Period をはじめ、数多くの業績を残されていらっしゃいます。また、多くの受賞歴をお持ちであり、2006年には旭日中受賞を受賞されていらっしゃいます。それではこれよりご講演いただきます。題目は、 War Memory 80 Years On でございます。それではグラック様、よろしくお願いいたします。
Thank you very, very much. I am honored to be here, and I thank all of you. I'm going to speak in English. For that, I apologize, but I appreciate your listening. Well, as you all know, it's 80 years since the end of the Second World War. That's nearly a century after the event, and still the war is an issue in many places. And not only in East Asia and Eastern Europe, which both experienced a resurgence of war memory after the end of the Cold War in the 1990s. But it's also relevant today when Vladimir Putin argues and defends Russia's war against Ukraine by saying it's a war against the people he calls Nazis. Right? And it's alive today in Netanyahu's comments comparing Israel's bombing of Gaza to Allied bombardments of Germany during World War II. So these are present-day uses of the past. A question this year is how we should think about the war 80 years on and the memory conflicts that it creates. In fact, to be honest, it was anniversaries that drove me to the study of memory. Beginning in 1987, before I met Narita Sensei, only Narita Sensei, our memories do not agree. I met you in the 1970s when we were graduate students. We can talk about that later. But in 1987, the 50th anniversary of the Nanjing Massacre, 1991, the 50th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor, 1995, the 50th anniversary of the end of the war, and on and on and on, including this year. As a historian of Japan, on each occasion, I was asked to comment publicly on one war commemoration after another. And I found, to my dismay, that there was a great gap, a deep chasm between public memory of the war and what I used to think of as history. So I began to study how public memory gets made, how public memory is created, how it's maintained, how it's changed. And in particular, why war memory should be so different from war history. Something I had never imagined. Although I am by trade, as you've heard, a historian of Meiji Japan, this war memory became a kind of mission for me. With the goal, and it is absurd, I confess, nonetheless, with the goal of somehow intervening in public discourse in the hope of bringing war memory and war history closer together. Have I succeeded? No. Am I still doing it? Yes. Okay. So, public memory, if I were to define it very simply, consists of the stories that are widely available at any given moment that reflect socially created views about the past. And these are stories that are produced in an ongoing, never-ending process that involves individuals, civil society, and the state, but is controlled, entirely controlled by none of them. war memory is everywhere national, which makes sense because nations fight foreign wars against other nations. People fight and die for those nations. So it is reasonable that war memory would be national in framing. A few years ago, university students in 11 countries were asked what percentage their own country contributed to the war effort. And these students in both the Allied and the Axis countries claimed such high percentages of contribution for their own country that the total came to 300%, when in fact mathematics demands that it comes to 100%. Right? But it's a sign of what young people know, mostly about their own part of the war. So the Japanese students did far less well about the European war, and the European students knew nothing about the Pacific War. So this is a very national story, war memory. And by the same token, memory politics in regard to the war are also national, often nationalistic, between countries. And yet, to tell about the war, to remember the war in entirely national terms is basically to take the world out of World War II. This is both bad history, it was a global conflict, and distorted memory. And it leads to conflict, these national views of the war. It leads to conflict both within and between nations in war memory. So to counteract this reasonable but unhistorical national views of the Second World War, my goal was to look across nations, across borders, with the objective of keeping the world in World War II. I found, first, that what I call the operations of memory, how memory works the same way everywhere. There are no cultural explanations here. It works the same way everywhere, at least in 20th century mass and social mediated societies. And it doesn't matter whether it's Japan, Germany, Indonesia, the United States. It works the same way. The second thing I found was that over the course of 80 years, mostly in connection with remembering the war, a global memory culture gradually emerged. And that global memory culture set different ideas and practices for how nations and peoples ought to remember the bad parts of their national past. So you have operations of memory I want to talk about, and then I want to talk about the global memory culture that now exists. And my third point has to do with what I am now calling post-war memory, Sengo no Kyoku. Because senso, war, and sengo, post-war, are a setto. They're a set. And there are commonalities, global commonalities to the different post-wars, and there are differences. And then I will end with a few remarks about the future of the past. I start with the original war stories that were told in every country. I call them heroic narratives, not because they're filled with heroes, but because they were so simple, so black and white, so absolutely clear, usually 5, 6, 7 words long, one sentence. Very strong plot lines of defeat or victory or emancipation from colonial rule or resistance. Some examples Austria, the first victim of nationalism, of Nazism. The Japanese, a people embroiled by their leaders in a reckless war. Makikomareta, embroiled. Indonesia gained independence from Dutch colonial rule. These historical one-liners told the whole story of the war, and those stories were created during the war or immediately afterward. Each story was determined by the particular historical context. That's true. But they had a lot in common. One thing they had in common were the narratives of victimization. I'm sure you've heard that Japanese are often described as thinking about the Second World War as victims. Well, it wasn't only Japan. I found this kind of story in very many countries, including Germany, I quote, which was a nation of anti-fascist victims facing a handful of Nazi perpetrators. And I found that word handful in a lot of countries. In other words, the people were the victims of their leaders. So Japan is not alone in that particular story. These folk tales of total war reflected the fact that it was a people's war, which is what it's called in Britain and the Soviet Union and other places, where the people were, after the war, could think of themselves as the victims of history. Now, these strong stories, they're powerful, but they're so simple, they have so many silences, that they're really stories of memory with most of the history left out. Right? You cannot tell the war in that kind of sentence. And yet, those simple heroic narratives have had a very long half-life. Many of them exist to this day with very little change. And that was a problem, a historical problem that I thought needed to be addressed. So I wanted to know, because some stories did change, how that change happened. And that led me to this analysis, this is my first point, of what the operations of memory are, how public memory works. So I mention aspects of the operations of memory, true in every country. First has to do with where you find public memory, where public memory is expressed. I call this the terrains of memory. Where do you look for it? One place you don't look is school textbooks, because it turns out they have very little impact on what most people know about the war as they grow older. These terrains include, first, the official terrain. You call that the state. National textbooks, the kind of textbooks that Narita Sensei spoke about. National commemoration, national museums, etc. The second terrain, this is the most important terrain now, is the popular terrain, or vernacular, I call it, vernacular terrain. It includes two sides. One is the consumption of war memory in the media and popular culture. And we have evidence around the world that the latest movie, whether it's Saving Private Ryan or AN No Zero, influences people's view of history more than what they learned in school so many years before. This is sometimes called, by scholars of memory, it's called memory in the wild. What they mean by that is it's memory out there in society. Not in the history books, but out there. The popular terrain includes, the other side of it is the production of memory, war memory. And this is done by a whole range of what we now call memory activists who work without stopping to include in public memory their own stories that have been left out of this very simple one-liner story. And that means things like comfort women and colonial soldiers in Asia and Africa, or the persecuted Roma in Europe, or the interned Japanese Americans in the United States. None of these were in that story, that simple story. So memory activists worked to get the word out. That's the most important terrain if you're studying public memory. It's popular culture, producing, consuming. A third terrain is the personal past. This is the opposite of memory in the wild. This is memory in the brain. This is individual memory. And neuroscientists tell us that individual memories work by remembering things from the past, but those memories are affected and changed by factors in the present. You think you're remembering as it was, but in fact your memory has actually been changed by things that have intervened. And that's important because particularly in war memory of people with traumatic experiences. Why is that? Because there are many particularly traumatic experiences about which people did not want to or were not able to speak. They weren't able to talk about it, A. B, no one was willing to listen. And that includes Holocaust survivors after the war. It includes the comfort women for decades. It includes the young, very young soldiers, the American, the Allied soldiers, the Russian soldiers who fought at Normandy and Stalingrad. So the personal past is not just what you remember, it's also in terms of public memory, what you can say out loud and be heard. Those are the terrains of public memory, war memory. A second aspect of the operations of memory is what I call, I made up the word, I'm sorry, the chronopolitics of memory. Now that invented word simply means that public memory is directly related to the political changes internationally in geopolitics, political changes in domestic politics. It's chronopolitics that explains the difference between the way war memory unfolded in post-war West Germany and post-war Japan. Germany confronted its wartime past in the international context of Cold War Europe and in the domestic challenge of generational political change in the late 1960s. In contrast, Japan's Pacific War story, Pearl Harbor to Hiroshima, was co-created by the US occupation and maintained under the Japan-US alliance and the LDP governments over the years, until pressure from Asian nations and the end of the Cold War brought Japanese public memory to confront the past of the Asia-Pacific War, in other words, the China War. And this was in the 1990s, and that's a chronopolitical change. So the comparison between Japan and West Germany is usually false when it talks about cultural or lack of courage or whatever. It's chronopolitics. A third aspect of the operations of memory, after terrains and chronopolitics, has to do with the direction of memory change. Remember, I was looking for what makes memory change happen, since it's very hard to make these war stories change. So I want to know where the change came from, what I call the vectors of memory, the direction. I found that it came from two places. in every country. First, it came from below, meaning from the diverse civil society of memory activists, in other words, not the state, who challenge different national narratives, usually because, as I said, those narratives exclude or misrepresent their own wartime experiences. The second direction is from outside, and that means from outside the country. International factors that exert pressure on national war memory, whether it's geopolitical conditions, as in Cold War Europe, or in post-Cold War Asia in the 90s, or international advocacy, as in the role of world Jewish opinion on the development of Holocaust memory. But when these two vectors, from outside, from below, when they come together, usually in the context of a changed political context, changed chronopolitics, then even stubbornly resistant simple stories can change. And different groups can, as it were, come into memory. Let me give you two examples. One of coming into memory, memory change, and one of memory unchange, no change. So an instance of memory change is the comfort women who came into memory during the 1990s. That these elderly, often poor and powerless women from across Asia who did not know one another or belong to any organized group, that they came to claim a place in the global memory commons, not only for themselves, but for women subjected to sexual violence anywhere, is an unlikely story and also an example of memory change. Former comfort women first told their stories in the early 1990s. They broke a long-held silence with testimonies, and those testimonies had been made possible by chronopolitical change in South Korea and post-Cold War geopolitics. Memory activists in Asia, including in Japan, and in the North American Asian diaspora, Canada, US, for their own and very different reasons, brought public attention to the comfort women issue from outside and from below. On the official terrain, continued denials by the Japanese government of the coercion of the comfort women had the ironic impact of helping the comfort women issue move into memory. So the uses of public denial kept the issue in the news, if you like. So it's this kind of complicated process. In addition, there were international trends in human rights and law. The rape camps in the war in Bosnia in the 90s, global concerns with sex trafficking and sexual violence raised the issue in international circles so that legal thinkers in the West routinely mentioned the comfort women in their arguments for making rape a crime against humanity, which is what the statute for the International Criminal Court did in 1998, a landmark change in international law. As a result, just as the Holocaust came to signify genocide, the comfort women became a globally traveling symbol for sexual violence against women in wartime. It had taken, wrote Ueno Chizuko, 50 years to change the shame of women into the crime of men. A second example, and this is an example of memory unchange, has to do with the atomic bombs. In Japan and the United States, the nuclear war narrative remains largely locked in the same place today as it was in 1945. The Japanese story, as you know, is that the atomic bombs gave Japan a mission for peace. The bomb doesn't end the war. It begins Japan's post-war mission for peace in the world. The American narrative is that the bombs ended the war and saved American lives, period. The bombs do not begin or even mention the human horrors of radiation or the age of nuclear warfare unleashed on the world by the bombs. So each country is telling only half the story. Japanese atomic memory does not focus on the aggressive war initiated by Japan in China, which culminated in the bombs. And the dominant US story says nothing of the nuclear age that the bombs generated. Now, such half stories, they're memory stories, are common in war memory around the world, and you can tell that they are certainly not true to history, because half stories are by definition not the whole story. That's a kind of summary of how I see operations of memory working. My second point has to do with what this global memory culture that emerged over 80 years, what it looks like, and the changes that have taken place in it. And here I'd like to mention 5. I think these things are extremely consequential, and I'm going to be very brief, but they are, I think, important. So there are 5 areas in which war memory has made significant change. The first has to do in the realm of law and how law treats past injustices, not present crimes, but things that happened in the past. Holocaust-related war crimes trials made victims as central as perpetrators, bringing the voices of victims into the courtroom for the first time in the Eichmann trial in 1961. And over time, the focus of these international trials shifted from perpetrators to victims, from war crimes, conventional war crimes, to crimes against humanity, from local law to universal jurisdiction, and this is new in international law. Civil trials, on behalf first of the Holocaust survivors and their families, led to a spate of class action lawsuits filed in the 1990s by forced laborers, by comfort women, by colonial soldiers, and others who were filing suits against their own government or foreign governments. Now, the suits filed against Japan, against the Japanese government, were routinely denied by Japanese courts. But it's a little like the uses of denial. The denial of these claims helped to shift public memory to have increased knowledge about these sufferings in the past. So even failed lawsuits contributed to public memory. So that's the law. And those developments in international law are entirely new, actually. I mean, rape as a crime against humanity, etc. Second area is the area of knowledge, as to how we know the past. Holocaust survivors, POWs, comfort women, survivors of massacres, and lots of others. From about the 1980s, but particularly the 90s on, made individual witnessing, telling their story, telling their memory story, a trusted currency of public memory. And they established a precedent for accepting the evidence of personal recollection, even decades after the event recollected, 50, 60 years later. Now, for many victims of past injustice, especially in the case of rape and sexual violence, written documents about these crimes never existed or were covered up or destroyed. And indeed, without these testimonies of the victims, there would have been no story at all because there were no documents. So this epistemological change of knowing the past and trusting personal past, personal memory as a source of knowledge. Third was a change in an understanding of rights in terms of obligations owed by states to their citizens. It's come to be known now as rights of memory. In the United Nations, it's called the right to the truth. You have a right, a civic right, to know about what happened to your family, so to speak, or whatever. And this includes the disappeared from Latin America in Chile and Argentina, and it includes victims of wartime atrocities everywhere. Now, these claims about the right to know, the right for public knowledge about your wartime experiences, in this case, they always demanded the same things. They demand formal public recognition of the acts. They demand monetary compensation or restitution. They demand official apology, and they demand education for future generations, a combination of never forget and never again. For many victims, these rights amounted to civil or social rights in the present. The past was the issue, the present was the objective. For the claims they were making against the state on the basis of human rights were for them signposts in a long movement from silence to rights, from injury to redress, from invisibility to citizenship. So that's the rights of memory. And fourth, a range of political actions relating to national and international views of history. The expectation that nations, governments, and peoples ought publicly to recognize their pasts, even the bad parts, whether war, genocide, or empire, gradually became part of political practice. And sincere or not, the politics of apology expanded to a degree unthinkable in 1945. Unthinkable. That heads of states would be apologizing to their own people for slavery, for discrimination against indigenous peoples, for suppression of minorities, and that heads of state would be apologizing to other states for actions taken during war or imperial rule. This is a product of the second half of the 20th century. And it became an expectation of the way one politically deals publicly with the past. And the last aspect of the global memory culture is changes in our ideas of responsibility. They've actually changed. We talk a lot about war responsibility, senso sekini. Right after the war, war responsibility was usually talked about in terms of demonic leaders like Hitler. Then it moved to organizational guilt. Those were the bureaucrats who were only following orders. And then, by the 90s, to ordinary men, these were German ordinary men, who engaged in atrocities in every theater of war, in every military, everyone. And by the end of the last century, even to more ordinary citizens, sometimes called bystanders, but increasingly talked about in terms of by not doing anything, they were in some way complicit with their country's war effort in what was, after all, a total war. So this is a different notion of responsibility. I mean, this just did not exist in 1945. Again, the Holocaust was the template for many of these practices and values that spread. The point was that people today are now held responsible, not culpable, because guilt cannot be inherited, responsible for knowing about the nation's past, at least knowing about it, and at most working to prevent the negative things from happening again. Now, my next point has to do with the role, my third point, has to do with what I'm calling Sengo no Kyoku, post-war memory and war memory in Japan with comparison to other post-wars. Now, the original post-war, almost everywhere, was a time when people were looking forward, not looking back. They were looking forward. They used words English words, that all begin with R-E. Reconstruction, rebuilding, reform, recovery. And what's interesting about that is that it's not that things were beginning new, they were beginning anew. All right? So that's why repair and reform were important. And all of these words, repair, recovery, reform, were emphatically national, continuing the 20th century framework of nation states. Even more national, perhaps, than before the war, partly because of the imperial nations having lost their empires and withdrawn into national borders. So, two commonalities about post-wars everywhere. One, the myth of rupture. 1945, German 0 hour. Japan, reborn, Shinsei Nihon. The idea that history could start again is a memory. It's not the way history works. It's a myth. It's a mythology. And that's true of, including, by the way, of the emancipation from colonial rule. The countries that thought 1945 was the break, like Indonesia and Vietnam, had to fight another between 5 and 20 years or 30 years for independence. So the break is mythic. It's not true, but it was felt. That's common. Second commonality, and this is important because Japan is often criticized Japanese are criticized for their amnesia of empire. The Japanese did not remember their empire. Well, the British didn't either, and the Dutch didn't either, and the French didn't either. It turns out that the war was what they remembered and not the empire. So only gradually did imperial memory actually become public, which is why Korea began to talk as much about colonial memory in the 90s as about war memory. So that's the belated imperial memory. It's a commonality between Japan and other places. Now some differences, some obvious differences. One difference is that Japan was more closed off than many of the European countries, partly because the European countries had an influx of people from the former colonies, and they became more multicultural. Another difference was there's no regional Asian community, like as there was in Europe immediately by the end of the 1940s. Another difference was that Japan had a political regime that didn't change. The LDP changed policies and changed course, but the government didn't change. And it's really unusual, even compared to other one-party dominant democracies like Italy. But the biggest difference, and the one that makes me talk about Sengo no Kyoku, post-war memory, is something I've been talking about since 1989, Narita-sensei, which is Japan's long post-war, Nagai Sengo, gomenasai. It's 2025, and what is Japan commemorating this year? Sengo 80 Shunen. There's no other country that commemorates the end of the war by calling it the commemoration of the post-war. No country. They commemorate the end of the war or the defeat or the victory, but no, that's not the post-war. Most of the countries in the world ended their post-war, the name for the post-war, sometime in the 1950s, after that period of rebuild, recovery, etc. was over. In Japan, as you know, there have been repeated pronouncements of the end of the Cold War, beginning in 1956, and as late as Abe Shinzo's, escape from the post-war regime. But it's not over yet. And this is where post-war memory becomes relevant. When asked their views of Sengo on the 50th anniversary in 1995, this is my favorite story. The Asahi poll reported on the poll, the headline was, post-war Japan, 84% affirm. Sengo Nihon, 80% kote. Huh? The idea that you are actually affirming the name of a period of time? Okay. Only in Japan. And this continued. That continued to Sengo 70 and Sengo 75. All the polls show the same thing. Even among youth, which is interesting, because the youth, a few years ago, they mentioned the same three important post-war events, youth in their 20s, as people in their 40s. And they were the great East Japan earthquake, the burst of the bubble, and high growth. But when you realize that those young people had never experienced either high growth or the bubble burst, you know that they must have gotten that view of Sengo from the media. This is a generation I think of as the Sengo Shiranai Sedai. These are the people, young people don't know post-war, at least not the post-war that their parents experienced. But they have the same idea about it. So what is the idea? What does Sengo look like? Well, the most common answer is peace and prosperity, a slogan that morphed over time from the original post-war slogan of peace and democracy. And it's still pretty much the same today. The peace perspective you can see in the debates over the Constitution and Article 9. So this content hasn't changed. In a way, the war, I'm going to be longer than that. In a way, the war, which is commemorated as a post-war anniversary, means that the bright akarui, decades after the war, receive as great or greater attention than the dark decades of the war. So the post-war acts almost like a screen memory. It blocks out, Sengo blocks out senso. Post-war blocks out war. This is what Freud meant when he said a screen memory blocks out usually more difficult or traumatic memories with a less traumatic memory. And in a way, that's how Sengo seems to work. Now, it's clear, I think, that since 1989, general Japanese attitudes about the war have changed. It's generally recognized as an aggressive war now. Sex slavery is viewed by young people as a violation of human rights. The views of what are called the neighboring countries are acknowledged as important. But it's also true that in the past several decades, there are a number of people in Japan who believe Japan has been criticized enough for its history problem and apologized enough to Asian victims of Japanese wartime actions. And this particular kind of war memory reflects the nationalisms that are on the rise around the world, not only in Japan. So what then, after the operations of memory, the global memory culture, and this screen memory of Sengo no Kyoku, of post-war memory, what is the future of the past? First, a word about the relation between memory and history. As I said at the beginning, my problem was the gap between memory and history. that those simple black and white stories did no historical justice to the way the war was, the causes of the war, the way the war happened, the course of the war, or the consequences of the war. And in part, that was because the nation remained the frame, effectively taking the world out of World War II. It was also true that commemoration, in the case of 80 years of the post-war, took the place of explanation. In other words, you commemorate and don't explain exactly how the war happened and what the results were. The result is what I think of as good memory, bad history. It's good memory because it's a good memory cause, for example, to try to achieve redress for the sufferings of forced laborers or the colonial soldiers. But when there's a good memory cause and history is chosen selectively, and you just choose the parts of history that fit your polemic to persuade people of your cause, it's bad history. That's good memory, bad history. And that's what you saw in the clash between the South Korean government and between the South Koreans and the Japanese government in the 2010s over the comfort women particularly. What you saw is both countries picking the part of the past they wanted to. So the Koreans said that all comfort women were coerced. They were forced. The Japanese government said all comfort women were voluntary. Both of them were bad history because there was a mix of voluntarism and coercion. So you had a memory conflict, not a history conflict. And my goal is to connect good memory to good history. And not for the sake of a particular national past, but for the sake of our interrelated collective future. I believe that we are now living in the middle of a rather large, great, if you like, big historical transition that occurs rather rarely. This one maybe began in the 1970s or earlier, depends on your view. But it's not over. It's not over. We're living in a period that has no name. It'll get the name when it's over. But right now we're post everything. We're post-colonial, we're post-modern, we're post-Cold War, we're post-Cold War, we're even possibly post-war. A few years ago, Japanese public were asked about the end of the post-war. 1/3 said, yes, it's over. 1/3 said, no. 1/3 said, I don't know. But basically, most of them agreed that we could still talk about post-war Japan. This is my view. I think that Japanese today are living in a time that I call Sengomatsu. Just as the Bakumatsu period represented the long end of the Tokugawa shogunate, the present age can be seen as the long end of the post-war, an ending that began some decades ago. I compare the changes that have taken place over the past 30 or 40 years within the post-war system, Sengo Taisei. I compare them with the changes that occurred within the shogunal system, Bakuhan Taisei, in the 20, 30 years before the Meiji Restoration. Viewed cumulatively, the changes that have taken place in post-war Japan have been dramatic. They don't always appear dramatic because they take place within this stable system. The changes suggest that a lot of the things that are going to become the future are already happening, because that's the way history works. The elements of the past become transformed in a new context in the present. The elements of the present become transformed in a new context in the future. So post-war Japan, or at least parts of it, is taking shape before our eyes. We just don't see it the way people did not see the fall of the Berlin Wall coming before 1989. As soon as the wall fell, everybody said it was inevitable. Before the war, before the fall, no one expected it. So imagine, if you like, the centennial of post-war Japan. Sengo hyaku shunen could happen. It could happen. But if it does happen, and it's still 100 years, and we're talking this way, how people might look back on our period and see how many changes had actually occurred that made Sengo Nihon, post-war Japan, a different place. So I'm suggesting that on the 80th anniversary of the end of the war, we can undertake to remember the war by keeping the world in World War II and connecting good memory to good history, but also looking ahead. And this is where memory itself, both war memory and post-war memory, can be a trap. It's often said that memory is the currency of our age, fixed with our eyes fixed on the past. But eyes fixed on the past are not looking to the future, by definition. And redressing past wrongs is of great importance. But equally or more importantly, I believe, is the need to envision future rights. And by rights, I mean future values. Mm-hmm. As the White Queen said in Through the Looking Glass, one of my favorite books, Kagami no Kuni no Arisu, it's a poor sort of memory that only works backward. So while attending to views of the past, which we can't change, by the way, there's no way that any of us can change the past. So we should attend to views of the past, but we should also turn our eyes to the future, which, after all, is the only part of history that we can actually affect. We can change. So to me, that's the challenge of this year, as the post-war continues its long ending in Japan, and the world, including Japan, moves through a difficult historical transition into a future that is in good part already here. Thank you.
グラック様、大変素晴らしいご講演ありがとうございました。皆様、今一度盛大な拍手をお願いいたします。ありがとうございます。それではこれより質疑応答に移ります。質疑応答の司会は人間文化研究機構理事の若尾正樹が務めます。それでは若尾理事、よろしくお願いいたします。
はい、グラック先生、どうもありがとうございました。国際賞の担当理事をしています、若尾です。日本の近世史思想史を、やっております。グラック先生の、講演の中にも話が出てきた安丸先生の、後任として、一橋大学に勤めて、もう僕は退任しましたが、グラック先生ともオンラインで安丸先生の話がいろいろできて、非常に、嬉しくて、楽しかったです。はい、それで、これから質疑に入らせていただきます。多分皆さんお聞きになっていろんなことをお聞きになりたいというふうに思いますが、時間的にあと10分くらいになりますが、ぜひご質問いただければというふうに思います。挙手をしていただければありがたいなというふうに思いますが、よろしくお願いします。はい、考えておられる間に一つ日本の戦後っていうのが非常に長い戦後が続いたっていうことですが、長い戦後が続いてるっていうことを最初に、これ長いんじゃないかっていうふうに思われたのはいつなのかっていうのを、ちょっとお聞きしたいなっていうふうに思います。10年ぐらいだと多分10年20年ぐらいだと他の地域も国も戦後っていうことを言うんじゃないかと思うんですが、長い戦後っていうのがどういうところでちょっと長いんじゃないって、日本はちょっと得意じゃないかっていうふうに思われた時期がいつなのかっていうのを少しお話ししていただければいいかなっていうふうに思います。
I think there are very good reasons why Japan's post-war is very long, and you can see if you compare it to other post-wars, the main reason is that post-war Japan produced a system that worked for people. Is it perfect? No, that isn't the point. The point is it was stable, it was peaceful, and it was by and large prosperous. And that meant that there was a an emotional attachment to Sengo. Most of the countries don't have any emotional attachment to Sengo. No, it's not emotional. I mean, if you remember the Showa Sanju Nen no nostalgia, remember that? Where people were looking at black and white rice cookers and black and white television and rice cookers from the 1950s and thinking about the glorious days of early consumerism. That doesn't happen in other places, okay? So that's the main reason it happens. When it will end, I'm a historian, not my job. I can't tell you when it's going to end. My guess is that it will not, my guess only, is that it's going to end gradually, not with an event like the Meiji Restoration of 1868. Enough is going to change that we'll get a name. It's not only Japan that's missing that name for now. We are all missing that name. So my guess is it will not be a cataclysmic end or a big event, but it will gradually give way. I hope, and I don't want to be here for this because I've had enough anniversaries, but I hope that by the 100th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, that Japan is no longer post-war. On the other hand, there are good reasons why you would cling, I just said, why you would keep to the name, because the name has content for Japanese people. It has content. It's not an empty name. Meiji Japan had content too. I mean, there sometimes have content, sometimes don't, you know. So that's the best I can say for that.
はい、どうもありがとうございます。手を挙げておられる方おられますでしょうか。よろしくお願いします。ありがとうございます。
おめでとうございます。一つ伺いたいことがございまして、一番最初にプーチンがウクライナ、これはナチスとの戦いだと、ネタニヤフがですね、ガザの爆撃、これある意味じゃドレスデンの爆撃のようなもんだとか、そこからお話し始められたんですけれども、この戦後の過去を克服するこの語りとか、この歴史認識ですよね。これもまた、結局はその戦後のリベラルインターナショナルオーダーの枠組みの中で可能になった語り、ナラティブであり、あるいは研究の機構なのかと、思わせるほどですね、激しくこの歴史認識今揺さぶられていると思うんですよね。この同盟にしても、じゃあブレトンウッズにしても、ガットにしても WTO にしてもみんなが崩れていくと。で結局リベラルインターナショナルが崩れていく中で、やはり歴史認識とかこういうものも崩れていく危険性が非常に強まっているのかどうか。特に中国とロシアが反ファシスト戦線と称していまだにじゃあ80年前のこれを一種の歴史戦として戦っていく中で、それ一緒になって戦うんですかと、いうことに対する非常なこの何て言いますかね、違和感っていうのも感じるでしょうし、その辺について伺いたいと思います。
つまり国際関係のコンテクストですか？そういう質問ですか？
そうですね。だからリベラルインターナショナルオーダーの戦後の枠組みの中で成り立ってきた歴史認識だったのではないのかと。
はい。それはそう。Exactly, that's true. That the international order was the geopolitical context, not only for Japan's post-war, but for Europe's post-war, etc. But that wasn't the only thing. What I found in many of these countries, and I think it's true of Japan as well, is that what the international context did for Japan was remove the international context from a matter of difficulty and challenge. And that was a positive effect, a benefit that of the Nichi-Bay Alliance tunnel vision, the turning away from Asia entirely, looking toward the Pacific. So although I think that the geopolitical context was important for war memory in every country, I actually think that in every country, maybe not every, most countries, it's the domestic, political, and social frame that most affects war memory, more than the geopolitical. These are domestic issues. And in Japan, I think, as I said, the peace and prosperity question, the relief, if you like, of not having to be out there in the world. So in effect, I think it enabled Japanese post-war memory in a different way than you might be suggesting. I'm suggesting that for Japan, it removed a problem rather than set a frame, and it was domestic life, let's put it that way, politics, society, whatever, that explains Japan's post-war. That's my view. I think, although we now know that the post-war international order is over, or almost, that's not the only thing that's happening. I mean, the point about this big historical transition, the reason it's a big historical transition is because so many things are happening at once. Everywhere, everything, all at once. That's why people talk about polycrisis. That's why people talk about the age of uncertainty. And that's not at all actually international. In most of these societies, that age of uncertainty is read in very domestic, very community, familial, individual terms. So that's what I would say about the international order, which, rest in peace, is over.
よろしいでしょうか。はい。すいません、お手を挙げていただいたんですが、時間が過ぎてしまいました。申し訳ございません。質疑応答はこれをもって終了させていただきます。まだまだお聞きになりたいことがいっぱいあると思いますが、申し訳ございません。グラック先生、どうもありがとうございました。ありがとうございました。
以上をもちまして、質疑応答を終了いたします。キャロル・グラック様、若尾理事、ご質問をお寄せくださいました方、ありがとうございました。これをもちまして、第6回人間文化研究機構日本研究国際賞受賞記念講演を終了させていただきます。